Today we'll be looking at test 77, game 1. And that game starts with 6 entertainers, just so you can double check that you're on the right test. And it seems like everyone who's here today is someone who we've all met before, so we don't have to necessarily go through the normal introductions and stuff like that. We can go ahead and get started. Okay, so like normal, I'll just go ahead and read the initial paragraph out in case anyone doesn't have it. And then I'll ask you guys to start breaking down the different variables, and we'll talk about how those variables given in the game can help us determine what kind of game board setup we'll have. So this game reads 6 entertainers, R, S, T, W, Y, and Z are being scheduled for the 6 performances on the opening day of a community festival. Each entertainer will perform at one of 6 times: in the morning at 9, 10, or 11, or in the afternoon at 2, 3, or 4, with no entertainers performing at the same scheduled time. Okay, so let's start with that. What are the 2 main groups of variables we see here?
The entertainers and the time slots, morning or afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks. So we have our entertainers, good, and our time slots. And there was one metric we talked about last time in terms of differentiating between types of variables in terms of determining types of games. So what's unique about one of our categories of variables here that informs what kind of game this is going to be? I know it's a pretty open-ended question. Maybe I'll phrase it a little bit better. What's unique about having time slots as one of our variables as opposed to just like proper nouns like people or cities or stuff like that? What do time slots specifically tell us about the structure of the game here?
That it has to go from left to right.
Good. Right. It has to go from left to right, or we go from like up to down. But what's kind of implicitly in that logic there? Right. So Brielle says in the chat that it's an ordering game. Exactly. And so that's kind of what you were saying, Annie. So when we have something left to right, what we're implying is that the order matters. We can't just put 9 a.m. in front of 2 p.m. but after 11 a.m., etc. There's a fixed order to one of our groups of variables, which tells us we have an ordering game. So just to kind of review that, that's why we start by thinking about what variables are present. Because if we see a variable that has a sense of order to it, so variables, senses of order, so that might be like times in the day, maybe like days in a week, months, years, etc. Or it might be things with fixed spaces, like for example, the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor in a building, or maybe like apartment A, apartment B, apartment C, apartment D, and a hallway, stuff like that. Those have a fixed sense of order that we can't manipulate. That's going to be an ordering game. Okay, good. So we know we have an ordering element here. Beyond that, we know some games are what we would call mixed games or hybrid games, where they have both ordering and grouping. Here, based on our other variable present, do we see any kind of grouping element? We don't, right? There's nothing here kind of implying that there's different subcategories of entertainers. It's not like we have like certain types of entertainers, or it's not like we're grouping them in terms of like whether they're, I don't know, singers or musicians or like comedians versus actors or something like that. They're all kind of the same category of entertainers. So there's no other grouping necessary. We would call this a strict ordering game then. There's no grouping element. It's just that that ordering. So strict ordering game. Okay. Awesome. Any questions on that so far? So that's how we always want to start. We want to think about what are the variables present? What do they tell us about the structure of the game here? Good. Now, as Anissa already mentioned, we can kind of think of this in a linear fashion in terms of the game board structure, because we have this ordering element. So a lot of people would write this left to right. We can do like 6 spaces here, and then write our 6 time slots. We could say 9, 10, 11, 10, 11, and then 2, 3, 4. We just want to remember there's kind of a break here, which maybe signifies that we're moving from morning to afternoon, so we don't confuse this as coming before this category. And as we talked about last time, it's totally fine if you want to write this vertically as well. So we could do like 9, 10, 11, 2, 3, 4. If that just makes sense, if that makes more intuitive sense in your mind, that's totally fine too. Okay, good. And then lastly, what else do we want to do in terms of our game setup before we get into our initial conditions? Kind of an open-ended question and kind of something that I think is already implied or we've already done mentally, but we want to just take stock of each of those variables that we're categorizing. So here, or in this case, that we're ordering. So we can just write them out, R, S, T, W, Y, Z. Write this out here. We're going to be sorting R, S, T, W, Y, Z. And we also notice there's 6 of those variables. There's 6 of the time slots. So it's going to be a 1-to-1 kind of ordering. And we know that because there's none going at the same time. And so there's going to be no overlap. There's going to be no one omitted. It's just going to be that pure or that strict ordering like we were mentioning earlier. Okay, so if there's no questions about that setup, we can go ahead and start on our conditions. So our first condition is R must perform at some time before Z. And we'll open it up. So does anyone want to think about how we could diagram that rule? R must perform at some time before Z. Good. Right. So we have a few different people writing out the 2 variables with a line in between them. R before Z. Good. And then Lola also mentioned we could write it maybe with a greater than sign. So Z greater than R. That works too. That's kind of representing the same thing here. And if that works for you, that's a good method. I think an advantage to writing it with this kind of these dashes here is, as we saw in last week's game, it becomes a little bit easier to add on other rules to an existing rule if we have it in this structure. So for example, I don't know if this will be the case in this game, but let's say we have a rule that says like R has to come after Y. It becomes easy to just kind of add that here if we already have it in this kind of structure. And then we can just build from that, like a Y is after W, or Y is before W. We can keep kind of adding like that. So Z greater than R, that works too. But there's kind of advantages and disadvantages to writing it like that. Okay, perfect. And then our next rule, Y's performance must be the next performance after W. Okay, that seems kind of similar to the first rule, right? But what's a little bit different about this one?
It has to be right after it.
Exactly. Right. So like Lola said, there's this fixed sense of order there. It's not just that R is coming at some point before Z, it's that it's specifically Y or W is right before Y. Exactly. So we can write it in a box like a lot of people are saying. Let's label these. This is our first condition. Second condition is that W is immediately before Y. Exactly. Good. Okay. Perfect. And then our next rule, T must perform in the afternoon. So here we need to go a bit more creative. How could we maybe represent this on our game board?
Wouldn't it be, could T equal AM and we know that it needs to be on the left side? So maybe kind of what, how she did the greater than sign, maybe we can figure out and do a rule like that for that.
Okay, so we could write that out. We could just like abbreviate it. We could say T equals afternoon or something as our kind of separate rule here. Because this is a rule specifically limited to space, it's introducing a spatial limitation as opposed to how the variable relates to other variables themselves. We want to see if we can also put it directly on the board. Does that make sense? We've talked about this before, I believe. When we have these sequencing games, spatial limitation rules are really helpful. They allow us to make a lot of inferences down the line, and they really restrict our options here. Whenever we have a logic game, our goal with different rules is to be able to restrict the options, right? The fewer restrictions in a game board, the more possible permutations it has, and so the more open-ended it is, and the less we know about it. But when we get rules here that really restrict the board, like this is restricting half the board in terms of where T can go. We want to see if we can put that directly on our game board. So it's good to have it on the side like we do here. So let's just write it like that. But then can anyone else think, how could we add this directly on our game board so that it impacts every other rule implicitly now? Exactly, right. So Joshua just wrote not T in that left-hand column, 9, 10, and 11. Exactly. So if we put not T here, now we've just integrated this rule completely into the board. And now that's a little bit easier, right? Because it's good to have it on the side, especially for practice. But now we've gotten to the point where we no longer ever need to look at this. And so it just saves us time, it saves us confusion. We kind of have one fewer rule now. We already have that rule 3 just integrated into the board. One thing I want to mention here is some students kind of get confused on, well, instead of doing that, why don't I just write this? Why don't I write that T has to be here, here, or here? Because that's saying what that rule is saying, right? It has to be in the afternoon. Again, though, we always want to think about rules in terms of how can they limit our possible options on the board. Again, if we think about logic games, we're basically taking some kind of hypothetical situation which has a very wider range of possible permutations, and then trying to narrow it down to, maybe a dozen, or maybe depending on the game, maybe even fewer, as we keep adding new conditions and stuff like that. So all that's to say, it's better to represent the rules as restrictions if we can. It's easier to read, and it helps us build more inferences from those rules in terms of how they impact other things. Does that make sense, everybody? I don't know if that was super clear, but basically, whenever possible, write this kind of rule as a restriction, as opposed to like in the affirmative here, like where it could go. It's easier to read for one, which implicitly means it's less prone to mistakes. And this becomes easier to build other inferences off of as opposed to this. Because this is always true, right? That 9, 10, and 11, it's always true they're not going to have T. This, though, is introducing 3 possible situations which could be true. It's just harder to build inferences from. Anyone have questions on that? Okay. And then our last rule, kind of similar. Z must perform in the morning. So how can we represent that rule here?
I think it follows the same rule as T. We just cancel it out in the afternoon section.
Perfect. Right, so we can just go and write out not Z for all of the afternoon. And so interestingly, I'm taking a quick glance at our questions here. Okay, we could maybe almost think of this as a grouping game if the questions were a little bit different, because we do have sort of a sense of grouping here. Right? We can think of like we have the morning group and the afternoon group. The thing is, as I quickly glance at our 5 questions for this game, none of them actually have to do with morning versus afternoon. So that looks like it's kind of a function of like the initial setup, but it's not really. Actually, we have one question like that. If W is scheduled for the morning, that's question 2. Let's see. So, okay, basically, this sort of has a grouping element, but I don't think we would call it a grouping game because it's not like a central element to our game here. And it's not like a big determinant of, it's not a big determinant of our questions and stuff like that. There's one question that kind of involves it. Maybe we can reflect on that at the end. And by the way, it's not like the test is not going to ask us to identify what type of game is this. Is this a strict ordering game or does it have some grouping elements? So it's kind of subjective, but it's just something we want to keep in mind as we go along. But I would still call this mainly a sequencing game. We'll talk about at the end based on what we do with our rules. Okay, so we've added all our initial conditions to our setup here. Now let's think about any inferences we can start to work with. So does anyone remember what are some of the things we want to think about when trying to find inferences? We already talked about one of them. And what is that one and what are some of the others?
I think I know we already made the inference for T and Z, but I definitely think that there is an inference for W and Y because those two both have to be next to each other. I'm just not sure on what the inference is, but I do know that that either has to be in the morning or in the afternoon, but it cannot ever be either unless it was between 11 and 2. So I'm not sure actually. I just know that that's possibly an inference.
Good.
For me, I believe an inference would be that Z cannot be at 9 a.m. because of the first rule. Sorry, 1 second. I'll just go back to my rules. The first rule that states that R must perform at some point before Z. So Z cannot be at 9 a.m.
Okay, awesome. Right. So what Lola and Anissa are saying, and what Josh also mentioned in the chat, are all different forms of spatial rules, right, or spatial limitations. So that's a really big source of inferences, especially on these sequencing games that we've talked about, are spatial limitations. We want to think about how do the rules regarding certain orders inform where variables can or cannot go. Exactly. So we've already out loud discussed a lot of these, and Joshua's putting some more in the chat as well. So spatial limitations, exactly. We know that because there always has to be something after R can't go at the end. we know there always has to be something before Z, so Z can't go at the beginning. And then that same logic applies to W and Y, right? W can't be at the end because there has to be Y after it. Y can't be at the beginning because we have to have W after. Good. Okay, let's see what else people are putting in the chat. So not Z and 9. We have that, not Z and 4, good. Not Y and 9, good. Not R.
For me, I put not R in 11. I wanted to see if that's correct because I figured that can go in the afternoon portion. So
Good, right, exactly. So we can go ahead and add that here too. So
And
not
Marie,
R.
could you, I'm so sorry. I kind of got lost and got a little overwhelmed by seeing it all written. Could we go
Sure.
back to the beginning and just redo that part, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, don't be sorry. That's a great question. Let's actually think of these visually and we can kind of move this around. So I think one advantage to having these, those are hard to move, but one advantage to having these blocks written out, for example, is that we can kind of visualize where things can and can't go. So that's a good starting place. We know that we have this W and Y block, and there's essentially 5 spaces for it, right? We could have it here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where it can't go is where one of the variables would not be on the board, right? So it can't go here because then if Y is in space 9, then W is off the board. So that's why we know, for example, what we have here, that Y can't be in 9. Conversely, we know that W can't be at the end because then Y is off the board, right? That's why we wrote here, not W. And then the same thing applies with R and Z. R and Z is a little bit more open-ended because they don't have to be directly next to each other, but they're at least going to be directly next to each other, if not even more spaces between them. So we can kind of think about it the same way. We can think about, oops. There we go. So same thing, we know Z can't be first because then R is going to be off the board. We know R can't be at the end because then Z is going to be off the board. And then what a few people have kind of mentioned already, Z also has these other limitations where Z can't actually be anywhere in the afternoon, right? So Z can't be here, it can't be here, which also means that R can't be in 11 because that would force Z to be in the afternoon. So I know other people have added more inferences so far, and we'll go through those, but those are the ones that we've already added to the board. So do all those make sense to everybody? I think, like I was saying, think about them visually. That really helps when we have sequencing or ordering, same thing, games. Any questions on that? Okay, awesome. Okay, let me see what other people have written. Not R and 4, good. R can't go in any slot from 11 to 4, good, exactly. Right, so we can kind of build on that inference. So Lasis is saying that we know R can't be here because that would force Z somewhere here, but that means R can't actually be in any of these because those are all going to still force Z behind it. Good, so R is not going to be in any of these, good. Z can only go in 10 or 11, exactly, that's kind of the same idea with that not R rule. Good. Which means R can only go in 9 or 10. Exactly. Good. Let me erase this R. Okay, perfect. So it looks like those are all the spatial rules. And that's quite a few, right? Especially when we think about the fact that there's only 6 variables in this game. With spaces 9 and 4, we've already gotten rid of half of our options. So it's a really restrictive. We made a lot of inferences that are going to be really restrictive, which is a good thing, like we mentioned. Or especially with R, for example, and Z, we can see Z only has 2 options now that it can go into. R also only has 2 options that it can go into. So those are really good things. Okay, Good. So spatial limitations is one big category of variables. I mean of inferences. That's one thing that we've worked through so far. Another category of inferences that doesn't look like it applies here, but will often apply are overlapping rules. So I know we've seen that quite a bit. Overlapping rules. Does anyone remember what that refers to? Exactly. So Rachel says, if any rules interact with each other. Exactly. So this game only has 4 rules, and it only has 2 rules that are not, we didn't put directly on the board. And so there's not a lot of overlap, right? But we've seen on previous games where we even had I don't remember if that was last week or a couple weeks ago. We had a sequencing game where I think we were able to connect every single variable into one composite rule. If you guys remember, we had something that was, I mean, it looks really different, but it was something like X to Y to Z to A, like to B to C to D, etc. So if we have something like that, that comes from being able to overlap multiple rules onto each other. Maybe like one of our rules was the one that told us that X was in front of Z, which was in front of A. And then we had another rule that was like X is in front of Y. And then we connect those two together, those two X's, that's the overlap to get this idea. And then from that, we can add the other rules, etc. So overlapping rules and variables is a really valuable source of inferences. It doesn't apply to this game, but it'll apply to almost every game. Okay, good. And then the last thing, we talked about this before as well. We want to think about the most versus least restrictive variables. Most versus least restrictive variables. Rachel said the 2 rules that involve Z helped us really narrow down the morning options. Exactly. Right. And so that actually, thanks for bringing that up. That really ties into what we're going to talk about now in terms of most versus least restrictive variables. If you guys remember, we mentioned this as an important source of inferences because it helps us kind of anticipate what our questions might be about. Does anyone remember why it's important to think about the most versus least restrictive variables in a game?
Because it sometimes helps us tell us where the rules can go and where they can't go.
Good. Exactly. And what kind of comes from that is we know we're probably more likely to be asked about variables that impact a lot of the board. So for example, Rachel mentioned that Z and also R, because they kind of work together, are very restrictive variables, right? They dictate so much of the board's structure here that there's quite a bit of limitation that comes with them. What that means is we're probably going to get questions that involve some kind of movement with R and Z, just because those impact so much of the board. Whereas if we look at, for example, let's see, do we see any variables here which are not very impactful of our 6 variable options?
S.
Exactly. Perfect. And I think that was Brielle. So why is S the least impactful here?
Because there's no rules restricting it.
Exactly. And you'll hear this called different things. You might hear it called like a floater variable or a random variable. Exactly. Any variable that doesn't have any restrictions to it, that's really valuable information. And we want to mark that off in some way. So what I'll often do is just circle the variable. That's usually what you'll see, or you can underline it or box it. But we want to take stock of that. S here doesn't really tell us very much of anything, right? The only thing that S maybe impacts here directly is, or the only inferences we can make from S is that because R only has two options and Z only has two options. If S is here, for example, then we know that like R has to be here because R can only be in one of these. Or conversely, where's that? Conversely, if S is here, then Z has to be here because Z can only be in 10 or 11. We've already seen that it can't be in 9, 2, 3, or 4. And then that determines the placement of it. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Basically, those are the most flexible variables. And that's good to know. And it's good to know what are the least flexible. One thing we might want to explore here is we can see that there's one space here that's kind of, let's write this out. So I just kind of noticed this as we started talking about S a little bit. There's two possible spaces that R can go into, right? We talked about how R can be in 9 or 10. And there's two possible spaces for Z. Z can be in 10 or 11. Does anyone want to think, how does that relate to S then? So if S goes in 10, then what does that tell us?
It tells us that R goes in 9, Z goes in 11, and W and Y go in the afternoon slots.
Exactly. Right. So we don't necessarily need to write this out as like we wouldn't necessarily need to write this or anything, but it's good to kind of think about mentally is S still does have some impact because of those restrictions with R and Z. So it doesn't have any rules attached to it. We would still call it a floater variable or random variable, but just because of the other limitations, it does determine half of the board. So it still has a decent impact, just not as much as the other variables.
Could you please review how Sierra figured that out?
Sure. Or Sierra, if you want to explain, feel free. If not, I'll also.
I could do it.
Mhm.
So if S goes in 10, since Z already can't go in 9 and R can't go in 11, and R has to go before Z in some space, that would mean R goes in 9, Z goes in 11 because Z can't go in the afternoon, and W and Y can go in either morning or afternoon, but all morning slots are taken up. So therefore it would go in afternoon, but W can't go in 4. So W would have to go in 2, meaning Y would go in 3 because it has to come directly after W. And finally, T would go in 4.
Thank you. I was able to keep up. Thank you.
Awesome. And keep in mind, we've talked about this before too. Inferences are really important, but every inference that we make or that we need to make, we can also make it once we're doing the questions too, right? Because those will kind of prompt us in certain ways, which are designed to get us thinking about them. So don't feel like you have to brainstorm every possible situation before even getting to the questions. Yeah, so actually, Rachel brings up that important point I was going to mention. So I think we concluded that W has to go in 3. Is that what we said, right? But it could also go in 2 because we could have it here or here. And again, this is pertaining to the situation where we have like R, T, Z, or it's not R, T, Z, R, S, Z. I don't want us to get too confused on this because this is just one particular situation which may or may not be important for the game. But if there's any initial questions, we can talk about that again. But if not, let's move on to our first question from the game.
This is a list question.
Good. Yeah, let's take a look at it. Right. So this is the structure of question that we're most commonly going to see with each logic game. Almost every logic game is going to start with this kind of question where we basically have possible game board setups and we're asked to sort through them. These are really valuable question type because if we have, let's say we come to a game and we're not really understanding how it's supposed to be set up, we should always feel confident that we can still not only get this question correct, but also gain information from it that'll help us set up the game board if we need that. What we mean by that is, but by the first part is, these question types only require us to understand the rules. We don't need to know how to diagram the rules. We don't need to know what the game board looks like. We don't need to understand the relationship that, like, or what a certain type of variable determines about the type of game. All we need to do is kind of read each rule and see, does that apply to a certain answer? And that's kind of easier if we see it in action as opposed to explaining it. So does anyone want to kind of walk us through this? We see our question says, which one of the following could be the order from first to last in which the entertainers are scheduled to perform? We have 5 possible options. How can we use our rules here to start eliminating wrong answers?
We can go through each rule one by one.
Right. Exactly. And that's really important. That's an important distinction. I think what some students do here is instead of going rule by rule, they go answer choice by answer choice. And that feels the same, but going rule by rule is much faster. So instead of taking answer choice A, which says R, S, Z, T, W, Y, and then applying that to each rule, saying, okay, does that work with rule 1? Does that work with rule 2? Does it work with our game board? Or here, rule 3, rule 4. Do the opposite. Take the initial rule and then apply it to each answer. That's going to be much faster. So we know, okay, our first rule is R is before Z. At some point, we have to, it doesn't have to be immediately before, but it's R is some point before Z. Which one of these answer choice breaks that rule?
E.
Exactly, E. Good. It's pretty easy to just instantly eliminate it. And normally, it kind of depends, but normally one rule is going to eliminate one wrong answer. So it's kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so E is out. How about our second rule? W is immediately before, or excuse me, Y is immediately before W. What answers or what answer or answers does that eliminate?
E.
B.
Good, exactly. B is out. Then our third rule that we integrate into the board is that T must be in the afternoon. What rule can
I have a question.
Mhm.
For rule 2, is D is also out, right?
Yes, I said D. I didn't say B.
Oh, okay. I heard different things. I got confused.
No, I did. I heard B too. I didn't know how B was out, but I did know for sure D is out.
Yeah, it's D.
Okay, sorry, I think I heard B, but yeah, D is right. I know it sounds similar. Okay, good. So D is out. So E and D. E and D as in dog. Okay. So we're looking at T must perform in the afternoon. Which rules does this, or which answers does this eliminate?
C.
Good, right, because C has it at 11 a.m., so that one's out. And then how about our last rule? Z must perform in the morning.
He's breaking that one.
A is out.
Well, let's think about what spaces here represent the morning.
Morning is 9, 10, 11.
So those first three spaces are going to be morning. And in A, where's Z?
In the morning.
It's in that third space, which would be 11 a.m. So that would be the morning. But then in B, where is Z going to be?
It's in the afternoon, part 2.
Right, it'd be at 2 p.m. Exactly. So B would put Z in the afternoon. So B is going to be out. Okay. Does that make sense, everyone? So that's kind of the process. So A is the only one that satisfies all of the rules. So A is our right answer. So that's kind of how we want to go through these initial questions, is through that process of elimination, going with each rule. And like I was saying, a really big takeaway here is we could have answered this question without knowing what the game board looked like at all, and without having diagrammed the rules, right? Like we didn't have to have any of this. It helped. It made it a little bit faster if we used this, but it wasn't necessary. Same thing with these diagrams. It might have helped to have a visual representation of rules 1 and 2, but it wasn't needed to answer the question. So again, keep in mind, if we're ever in a situation where we just don't understand what a game board is supposed to look like at all, we don't understand what the rules are really, how we would diagram them at all, we should still feel confident that we can get that first question, and we can probably use it to help us understand the game board structure. Like now, after looking at this first question, we have a sample game board, right? We know that one possible permutation here is going to be RSZ. Let's write it in the corner. One possible is RSZ. Here's our little morning afternoon divide, and then TWY. TWY. So now if we had started with that, it kind of gives us a clue that, oh, this is probably an ordering game, because we see the question was asking us to put these 6 variables in a certain order. So it just gives us a clue about what it's supposed to look like. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to to question 2. So question 2 is an if question, meaning that it's introducing a new condition. And as we talked about before, these types of questions, the new condition that they're introducing only applies to this particular question. It doesn't apply universally, it's only for this question 2. So that new condition they're adding is if W is scheduled to perform in the morning. Okay, and what we want to add here, normally for these if questions, we want to add a new game board, or maybe multiple, and then start working with them. So what can we do here with this new information? And actually, Jasmine's putting an answer choice. So maybe Jasmine, do you want to, in the chat or out loud, describe your process for this question 2?
Sure. I could go. So I chose B because, but first I mapped it out on my board. So it says that W has to be in the morning. And so if we are keeping in mind the rules, RC have to also be in the morning. So the only way for W, I guess for W to be able to have Y next to it and RC to be in the morning, the board will have to go RCWY. And then at the end, you have ST that could go in either 3 or 4 p.m. Like they're interchangeable. There is no one place where they both could go. So I just put ST in both 3 and 4 and then started the other ones RCWY. And so if you go after I had my board, the only I went by all the answers. So the first one said Robinson is scheduled to perform at 10, and then I just looked at my board and that's incorrect. So I just took that out. And then it says as is scheduled to perform at 3. And since that made sense in my board. I just chose that because this is a question that says could be true. No, it has to be true. So this could be true because that's what it shows on my board, that S could be in either 3 or 4. So I just picked that answer.
Awesome. Good. So that was perfect. Does that make sense to everybody? One thing I would say is that not everybody, so Jasmine made an awesome inference at the beginning, which is that there's going to be some relationship here with W and R and Z, right? Because we already know, as we'd drawn a little bit earlier when we were discussing how S plays in, we mentioned that R and Z, like R only has 2 spots, 9 or 10. Z only has 2 spots, 10 or 11. And so when we introduce W into the morning too, we know that W can't bring Y with it, right? Because then there's going to be 4 things in the morning now. What I mean is W can't bring Y with it into the morning, because then we're going to have 4 morning variables, but only 3 morning spaces. So the only place for W is 11. And then everything else just falls in place from there. We know Y has to come after that. We know that Z has to be here, R has to be here. And then, like Jasmine was saying, S and T can flip, which is why it's a could be true, not must be true question. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Awesome. Okay, Lola, I don't know if you had a question. I couldn't hear super clearly. Okay. Okay, awesome. Let's look at the next question, number 3. So here we have kind of like a universal question. So this one's not introducing a new condition. It's just something that we can infer from our existing rules already. And with these, we often want to check our game board. We might have already made this inference somewhere. So let's take a look at it. And actually, let's leave that previous game board on the side because that might be helpful. Just a general thing to remember on the game section, we always want to save previous work. It's often going to become useful in the future. So let me move this. Oh, it's hard to move things on Zoom. Move this up here. Actually, I'm just going to write it. So we'll write it to the side here. So another possible game board besides the one we got from question 1 is the one we got from question 2. So R, Z, W, and it's actually 3 game boards because one of them is where we have ST and the other one is where we have TS. And so this might come in handy in the future. Oops. Okay, but anyway, we're here being asked about where S can't go. What answers can we eliminate based on the sample game boards we already have?
Can eliminate B and E.
Right, we already know that 10 a.m. is fine because we can see that in our first game here. So let's write out all of our letters, A, B, C, D, E. We know 10 a.m. is fine, so that's out. What other options are already given from our game boards?
Three and 4. So E is out.
Right, exactly. Good. So this is a good example of why it's important to save our work. Now, with no actual extra mental effort, we've already eliminated 40% of our answers. So now we're between A, C, and D. And now we can start to kind of think more deeply. So where, and here we can kind of do process elimination if that helps. Like we could just check, we could try putting S in in 9 and seeing what happens. We can try putting it in 11 and 2 and seeing what happens, or we can also try to visualize how it impacts other variables here. So either one works. Does anyone have a way they want to go about this question?
It can't be scheduled at 9 o'clock.
Okay, let's take a look at that. So we put S at 9. Okay, if S is in 9, then what else happens in our game board? Or what else could happen?
R and Z, well, R is at 10, and then Z is at 11.
Good.
W and Y can go at 2 and 3.
Would you mind repeating that? I couldn't hear exactly.
W and Y can go at 2 and 3.
Okay. I'm not sure why I'm hearing kind of an echo. Do you want to maybe type out in the chat? Sorry about that, Lola. And also, I see Jasmine put an answer choice here. So Jasmine, do you want to maybe explain as well what kind of thought went into that?
So I chose D. I did the same thing. I like using the board because it makes me realize things. So I eliminated both B and E, and then with the remaining answers, I just tried to create different scenarios. So for 9 a.m., if we put S in 9 a.m., then it will be SR, C, WY, and T, and that works because there is no problem with that because T will be in the PM, WY will be together, and RC will be one after the other. So I eliminated that one. Then for 11 a.m., it was the same thing as the 9 a.m. because the only thing that it would change is that instead of RC being 10, 11, it will be 9, 10, and it will still work. And so that's why I chose 2 p.m. because there is no way in where S will be in 2 p.m. because then WY and T wouldn't really work. And so that was the only scenario that I thought made sense.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so here we can see that was a really great application of just process elimination. And that can be really useful, especially like we were talking about in this situation where we already eliminated B and E off the jump. That saves us a lot of time. It's a lot easier to do 3 possible game boards as opposed to 5. And so here we checked S in 9, it worked. We checked S in 11, it worked. So just by process elimination, we know that D is the right answer. But just by checking that S here, like Jasmine was saying, it would basically force W and Y to split up because we couldn't put them here. There wouldn't be any room to have R and T, and then we couldn't put it WY. We couldn't put it at the end because then we would have T forced in the morning, which it can't be. Good. Does that make sense to everybody? And let's a couple minutes left. Now we have a lot of game boards, right? We have 2 additional ones we can add to our little samples over here. We have SRZ, WYT, we have RZS, WYT. Let's see if we can kind of quickly go through question 4 using that previous work, if you can. So 4 says, what is the earliest time that W could be scheduled to perform? What answers can we eliminate just based on what was already stated or already written?
Since we know that R and Z have to go in the morning, there's only room for one other element in the morning. So the earliest it could go would be 11 because it has to have Y with it. So if you tried to put W and Y in the morning, then you would not have room for both R and Z.
Perfect. Exactly. And we can see that kind of builds on something that we already saw with question 2. And so again, it shows how that previous work can be really helpful. The earliest we could put W is here, because like Rachel said, we can't have 4 morning variables for 3 morning spaces. Exactly. So our answer is going to be 11 here, or C. Okay. Might as well go through 5. Let's just finish with this one. So which one of the following is a complete and accurate list of the entertainers who must be scheduled to perform in the afternoon? So again, let's see if we can use our sample game boards to help us narrow down these answers if we can. So we have a couple of people saying C. Does anyone want to walk us through how they got C here?
I simply just used the boards that you had up and saw that there was a common trend between T and Y being in the afternoon, and that was the only one that logically applied. Let's see.
Right, exactly. And we know this is a must be true, right? So we can just eliminate based on anything that we have counterexamples for. We have a counterexample of W being in the morning with our second game board here. So that eliminates B and D. And then we have a counterexample with S, which eliminates from 3 of our game boards, which eliminates E. And then we know it's not just T, we also understand that WY rule. Y has to be in the afternoon, so C is right answer. Good. So great. Another example of how we can use sample game boards to really quickly work through those later questions. Okay, awesome. Any final questions for this game? Awesome. So just to kind of preview next class, so next week we'll be going over test 72, game 3, which is another ordering game. So that'll be a good way to kind of build on these skills as well. But have a good rest of your night, everyone, and then I'll see you next time.